Born to be one. Coming together to redefine container shipping. We are one, believing in the power of working together. We take on new challenges every day with the uniqueness you see in our color. Overcoming obstacles beyond borders and cultures. On the sea, the land, and in the hearts of people. We refine the way the world moves. One has power. The strengths of many united. As a team with customers and partners, we can give life to a new way to move the world. As one, we can. One, Ocean Network Express.
Welcome to this discussion, Shipping, Achieving Zero Emissions by 2050. This session is supported by Ocean Network Express. My name is Charles Goddard. I'm Editorial Director at Economist Impact. This World Ocean Summit Insight Hour is part of an ongoing dialogue we are having on the decarbonisation of shipping, and I think is an opportunity for us to take stock of progress as we come up to some important meetings and milestones. Notably, in June, member countries of the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, the UN body that regulates global shipping, will again deliberate on decarbonisation, among other things, as it faces pressure, I think, to pick up the pace. At present, it has a commitment to cut emissions by 50% by 2050, about half the reduction the Paris Agreement calls for, and there is an implementation plan in the making as well, and that is a work in progress. The United Nations Ocean Conference, a little later in June, just to talk about another milestone, another important moment, will of course be watching the outcomes very closely, as rapid and extensive reductions in carbon emissions are essential to restoring the health of the ocean. And of course, this is part of our World Ocean Summit, and the health of the ocean is of considerable importance to that discussion. And as we speak, the urgency, I think, of decarbonisation has been made absolutely plain. A new record for the highest daily level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has just been set. Well, picking up the conversation, I am joined today by four excellent panelists. Let me introduce them. Jeremy Nixon, Chief Executive of Ocean Network Express. Georgie Gobin, who is Head of Projects Implementation at the International Maritime Organization. Michael Parker, who is Chairman of Global Shipping, Logistics and Offshore at Citi, the bank. And Leslie Dang, Managing Director of Nautilus Labs in Singapore. So let's jump in, shall we, and go straight, if I may, to the International Maritime Organization, to Georgie Gobin. We are, as I mentioned, coming up to MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee's 78th meeting in June, where decarbonisation within the IMO structure sits as a deliberation. Georgie, I understand you can't make predictions about what's going to happen at that meeting, quite rightly so. It's a meeting of member states, of course. But I just wanted to begin with you and ask you what your hopes are for that meeting, which is enormously important, I think. And where do you think the IMO should be in terms of the decarbonisation discussion?
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe just to give a bit of a background. So IMO, as you rightly said, is the UN body to to regulate international maritime matters, as such also GHG emissions from international shipping. It's a UN body. So just like UNFCCC, it has member states, 175 member states who negotiate and meet, and it's mainly the same member states. So it is having a big strength, though, compared to some other UN agencies, and its strength is that beyond setting targets and strategies, these strategies are very quickly translated into binding measures. For example, standards. So we have seen recently adopted strengthened standards, both in relation to energy efficiency and to fuel standards. So these are mandatory regulatory requirements for a sector that is responsible for transporting almost 90% of global trade. And the member states in IMO have been negotiating also during the pandemic, looking at the initial IMO GHG strategy, how to strengthen it. There are concrete proposals on the table. There are a lot of proposals, both from member states and from NGOs, who are also part of the negotiation process. And it is foreseen that the new strengthened IMO GHG strategy will be adopted at MEPC 80 in 2023. So not this year, but in 2023. When you ask me that what I would hope that this new package will entail, I can start what I know it will have. So when the new GHG strategy will be adopted by means of binding regulations, it will have far-reaching implications globally for ship manufacturers, operators, and overall for the maritime industry. Already now, 97% of the global fleet is sailing under the ratified Marpol Annex 6. So traditional port and flag state control built into the IMO framework enforcement mechanisms work well. We also have already the Energy Efficiency Ship Index and the Carbon Intensity Indicator. There's a rating system already now. So there is a lot to build on to make the system even more stronger. It has to be done, and this is the really tricky part, I believe, in a way that recognizes the ambitions of many of the countries and many of the big industry players who want to move faster and who can move faster, in a way that developing countries are not left behind. There is no chance of having a half solution where you are risking that half of the world developing country experts are not going to reach the global markets. So I believe this is why the negotiations are really exciting ahead. The way I mentioned, there are a lot of proposals on the table. And my hope is that indeed by 2023, MEPC 80, there will be a compromise found and we can move ahead. We can move ahead in a timely manner. In the meantime, as you mentioned also, Charles, just to note that IMO has also recognized the key importance of implementation and supporting developing countries' LDCs and seeds, that they are not left behind by projects. And we've seen here a growing number of GHG-specific projects, especially with pilots. So piloting new technologies, piloting various alternative fuels and their usage at ships and at ports in developing countries. We are supporting this through the Green Voyage 2050 project, by our GMM project. We also have a specific project focused on LDCs and seeds called GHG Smart. Together with the World Bank and EBRD, we are leading the FinSmart Roundtable, looking at financial solutions for shipping decarbonization. So I think many things are going on parallel to the regulatory negotiations to showcase and to understand that where developing countries can benefit from the decarbonization process, and that how to make the global decarbonization in a way that they are not left behind. And to me, this is the key interest, that we come up with a regime that is capable of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. And would you see, I mean, COP clearly had a great challenge in addressing the concerns and needs of developing countries. Do you see that as being essentially an obstacle or a sticking point in the potential agreement or reaching an agreement in negotiations in MEPC 78?
Just to highlight again that our timeline is to come to a new agreement by MEPC 80, and there's a reason for it, because there are many things to be negotiated, many things technical in nature, many things short, mid, long term. Mid, long term is now the focus area. There are various proposals on new GHG measures, including market-based measures. You also mentioned that the emissions are growing right now. It's also because of the fuel usage. Had we decarbonized earlier, we would not see the increase in energy prices so much right now either. And there is a whole new landscape also because of the war and because of the realization that there will be potentially also competition for alternative energy sources. So there are many things at stake beyond the overall challenge that I mentioned, that how can we make a regime that is flexible enough to let those move faster who are capable, and to make sure that the developing countries are not left behind. Saying so, we have started with differentiation. So differentiation is already ongoing on the current fuel standard rules, for example, where there are also different energy efficiency requirements for different ship types. So this is something that's already happening, and I'm sure that there will be solutions found. But indeed, this is one of the key points, that how can we have a global regime that is also benefiting developing countries.
Thank you very much, Georgie. I wonder if I could just sort of pick up that last point, Michael Parker, and just sort of come to you to just think about this the differential speeds that are sort of are there implicitly in the IMO negotiations, that developing countries and developed countries are in some ways moving at different speeds, and ask your thoughts about what the priorities now need to be at the IMO, and indeed, in particular, this question of whether or not there's a risk that the IMO, unless it moves a little bit more quickly, will potentially be sidelined or marginalized, at least in some areas of the work it's making, particularly in finance and moving forward in shipping, in making some of the decisions about decarbonization, and whether or not it might suffer from some marginalization as a result.
Charles, that's a very good question. And I think the way I would sort of answer it is that whilst there was disappointment after COP26 that the IMO MEPC meeting immediately following didn't follow up, if you like, in the same enthusiasm that most of the governments had shown in Glasgow around commitments to the Paris Agreement, I think we recognize that the shipping industry is very fortunate in having a global regulator, and we must respect that. But it does, as a UN body, it has to deal with many of the things, not just the regulatory things that Georgie talked about, but also many of the political things that make this a very important aspect of deciding how decarbonization and global trade in a decarbonized world can be equitably managed. But I think the private sector is not going to wait for the IMO. And the risk to the IMO, to the point at the end of your question, the risk to the IMO is it will become marginalized because either regional governments or governments, major governments like the US and China and others, will make their own decisions, not so much to undermine the IMO, but they will make decisions that the private sector then is regulated de facto by. And that is, I think, a risk to the IMO. If it falls too far behind, that would be the problem. Now, in Glasgow, or before Glasgow, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was established. The number of $130 trillion was bandied around. But the reality is the financial sector who want to get on with the decarbonisation of the global economy isn't really going to wait for regulation if it doesn't have to. So the initiatives by leading companies, and no doubt Jeremy will talk about what Ocean Network Express is doing, those are the things investors want to see happening. And because shipping has the technology, it's asking governments to help around, if you like, regulating the infrastructure, producing the mechanisms that will make that economically fair, both to the smaller developing states, but also to the major companies that want to get on with this, so that the mechanisms are there to deal with the higher price of alternative fuels and things. So I think that's a good thing, and that hopefully will encourage the IMO to get on with it. I understand the point Georgi made about 2023 being the time when the IMO will come out with its long-term ambition. But the reality is, up to and since Glasgow, almost everyone else has made it clear their ambition is the Paris Agreement. It is reaching the 1.5 or thereabouts net zero. And the longer the IMO falls behind the commitments being made by everyone else, the risk to the IMO being marginalized by the EU or by other governments, I think, increases.
So, Jeremy, let me just pick up there if I can and just ask you, what are your expectations for MEPC in June? Do you feel there's a risk that the IMO might, in part, become marginalized as the private sector, and I know that Ocean Network Express is moving forward quickly, as indeed are many of your competitors and your financiers. Do you think there's a risk that there is going to be a bit of a fragmentation in the global policy landscape around GHG emissions and decarbonisation?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. And I think Michael summarised it very well. And I think we're all really supportive and really want to support, and we want the IMO to move us forward. And we all accept that the last 2 years have been very, very difficult for many organisations, whether in the private sector or the public sector. And of course, not being able to meet in public and etc. has obviously been a challenge. So I think all we can do is continue to try to indicate that we are really positive to change. And I'm talking really here on behalf of the shipping companies, and particularly the container shipping sector, which my company is involved with. So the World Shipping Council, which is the trade association for all of the container shipping operators, we've actually put together a kind of green strategy document, which we've forwarded to the IMO to try and show them some support leading up to MEP 78, really willing them on and showing that actually industry is to some extent getting ahead of the politicians now, and we would like the industry to get clarity now on a number of measures. And I think there's some good progress being made. And we talked about the CII and the EXI and the EDI. That's all good. I think the really critical one is the market-based measures and trying to avoid other competing continents or regulators chipping in as well with their different policies, which could contaminate the overall picture. Because at the end of the day, shipping companies such as ours, we're servants of global trade. We move over 250 million tons of cargo a year, and between 120 countries in the world. And we need to run to one single system. So we need to have very clear transparency about what the rules and regulations are, make sure that those are enforced. And, we are, like many shipping companies at the moment, each year having to make investment decisions around the type of ships that we're going to purchase and where we're going to operate them and the type of fuels we're going to use. And as we all know at the moment, the big challenge is that the green fuels are not available at scale at the moment, and they're going to be very expensive. But we don't see that as an excuse for doing nothing. And we do need to try and reach in the next, I think, 3 to 9 months, as much clarity as possible on the way forward, because a number of leading companies in the industry are starting to make some quite significant investments or pilots. And we can only do so many of those in an environment where things are not clear. We do need a lot more clarity so we can move forward quicker and at bigger scale.
Well, I think that thought that the risk of separate national and regional regulatory initiatives, in a sense, as you say, I think contaminating or potentially contaminating the overall picture is a significant one. You spoke obviously about the various different market-based mechanisms that might be in place, and as I mentioned right at the beginning, Japan has just come up with one set of suggestions, but there are a number of other suggestions out there, including suggestions which are not based around a carbon price, but as you mentioned, carbon intensity. Where do you feel the sort of key, I guess, the key advantages are in the carbon levy, I believe, that One Ocean Network Express is interested in, versus, say, a carbon tax or a separate mechanism like a carbon intensity mechanism? What are the advantages and disadvantages of those different approaches? Jeremy?
Indeed, Charles, and as you rightfully say, there are many different market-based measures. I think at the end of the day, as the operators and owners of ships, we want something that is relatively clear and easy to explain to our customers, who we ultimately will have to pass this cost on to through the supply chain. So we need something that's transparent, is logical, and is predictable longer term. And so that we can build our planning decisions around that, and we can explain that in a logical manner to our customers, who in turn can explain it to their customers. And so that's why we like the concept of some type of carbon levy, because already today we have energy cost indices which we build into our contracting process with our customers, which are built around the fuel price. And if we can substitute in a levy into that fuel price formula, it makes it a lot easier to explain and predict and to show how to take things forward. So that's why we, I think, generally as an industry and on the container shipping side, prefer that way of working. If we get into the areas of getting involved in kind of different trading systems and derivatives and offsetting and stuff, it gets very, very complex and very difficult to predict. So we'd like to try and keep it simple. We're not trying to dodge the bullet. We're ready to start paying market-based measures, but we need to look at the practical implementation of these, and also to set them at a level which is realistic. So today, we have to realize that there are not sufficient fuel, and therefore, just making a market-based measures into a tax is actually not going to help the situation. We need it to be something that's going to be set at the right level to incentivize the first movers to get on with it. And then later on, if the laggards are not coming on board, then there will be a higher level of penalization for still using carbon fuel. So it needs to be also, to be a realistic implementation over a period of time.
Well, let me come back to that in a short while, and then talk also, I hope, about what potentially the revenues from one or other of those kind of market-based mechanisms might be used for, and how they can be prioritized. But let me come, if I can, to Leslie Dang. And just first of all, I realize that your focus is around ocean supply chains in particular, but I would just want to start and just ask you just broadly what your thoughts are around the latest IMO negotiations that are just about to take place in June, and whether you feel at the moment the member states are pulling in the right direction and moving quickly enough before we talk a little bit about some of the broader supply chain issues.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Just to give you a bit of background on where at Nautilus Labs we are coming from. We are a technology company, and in that sense, we are really focused on allowing our clients, ship owners and ship operators, to make better decisions, to share insights based on data. In that sense, we are also positioning ourselves between ship owners and ship operators, allowing them to really increase transparency between them. And what we've seen since the implementation and discussions around MEPC 76 and the upcoming 78 is that there is definitely an uptake in the discussions with technology companies on what are the best solutions to be implemented. And what we've seen is that when we bring better decision making, data driven insights, we are able to really save up to 12% of fuel. But this can be actually increased 3 times if there was a way to tackle structural inefficiencies and misalignment that is very much driven by the way charter parties are written, but also by the way some of the regulations are written. So to come back to some of your previous questions, like really our hope is that some of those misalignments are tackled in the next round of discussions of regulations, because that actually really impedes our goal to decarbonize the industry.
Could I just ask you to explain a little bit more what you feel those misalignments are? You say misalignments between ship owners, financial institutions, and regulatory bodies. What do you see those misalignments as being?
Yeah, I mean, to make it very simple, you have today ship owners that are responsible for CI grades, let's say. But on the other end, you have charters that are responsible for voyages, for selecting a route, for selecting the speed the vessel is going at, which has an impact on that CI grade. And the owner is therefore not fully in control of what their grading is going to be. So there is a need for the charterer to be empowered to help the owners to have more visibility on how their CI grades are going to be impacted. So that's where we've seen a lot of misalignments. So I can give you an example. Like LNG right now is at a very high price, and we have vessels that need to reach terminals at a certain cargo temperature and pressure. And vessels need to obviously burn that excess boil of gas. And there are 2 ways of doing it. There are ways of running laps or before, like increasing distance sailed to burn off that excess gas and reach the port, or just use a gas combustion unit. The latter is actually the most efficient, but with the way CI is written, there is an incentive to increase the distance sailed. So we've seen all of those behaviors that are not beneficial to neither parties. And that's really a direct consequence of the way regulations are written.
Thank you very much. Let me just come back, if I can, to the sort of decarbonization question around the IMO. And if I can, Georgie, and I'm sort of, in a sense, sort of thinking that you are going to be able to talk a little bit more widely about what's happening, say, for example, in the European Union. I mean, obviously, the European Union, the 27 countries of the European Union have already given their support in the IMO for full decarbonization by 2050. Though I think it's kind of interesting to look at the EU's own Fit for 55 plans and recognize that in those plans, those greening plans for their economies, that they're quite thin around the detail on implementing these for shipping, at least zero emission targets for shipping. I mean, there's one area that stands out there, I think, and that is that there isn't really a guarantee that, and this is going back to the discussion that we were just about to have earlier, there isn't a guarantee that shipping revenues in the European Union would be used from the emissions trading scheme in the European Union for the maritime industry to achieve decarbonization. So within the discussions at the IMO, and I know the European Union has quite a lot of weight in those discussions, where do you feel the revenues from market-based mechanisms are best going to be utilized, and how is that discussion evolving?
Thank you, Charles. I'm not in the position to give you any views on the EU's own regulations, so that's up to the European Union that I'm not representing here. When it comes overall to MBMs and MBM proposals, as I mentioned earlier, and many of the colleagues also mentioned here, the negotiations are already ongoing. So you mentioned one proposal from Japan. We have many proposals on the table, which have different ideas. Just maybe for the benefit of everyone, that why at all we are talking about MBM. So one big reason behind is that how to motivate the first movers. So this was already mentioned, that of course when it comes to decarbonization, we are also talking about paying for the development of alternative fuels, paying for the infrastructure that is necessary. And we heard before that it can be only done in a coordinated manner, so in a coordinated manner between ports, ships, and beyond, also in coordination with the fuel suppliers. We also talk about it because there's an expectation that we decarbonize, but at the end of the day, it's going to be costing also to the consumers potentially. So this is why we need to see that how we can mitigate that cost. The way I mentioned, there are many different proposals. Some of them would like to bring it closer back to the industry, bring it closer back to R&D. Some of them would like to progress on wider climate ambitions. And I think that there will be, that's my personal view, there will be probably a hybrid compromise in between these, as many times in UN negotiations. And just to come back to it, that from the side where I'm coming, which is supporting countries in their implementation, it will be also key that we will recognize the special situation of the developing countries. And we heard before all the great initiatives of the private sector and the alliances. They are all West-North alliances. So it's very rare that we see developing countries in these. And as a global organization that is dealing with global shipping, which is the backbone of global trade, I cannot stress enough that we can only do things if we have everyone on board. Saying this, I would not say, to stop and not do anything until the negotiations are finalized. On the contrary, so the more pilots one can do, the more pilots can support also in developing countries. And if I would have one message, it would be these pilots in the upcoming years. The better it is, and it also supports the regulatory framework that we can see even more where are the potential challenges or where are the benefits. And we have also started working on a very interesting new concept called IMO Cares, which I would also encourage you to follow, and we are also happy to have discussions on it later. We aim to follow up on the UNEP IMO Innovation Forum of last year, and we are developing a concept on how to link together the R&D centers of the North, let it be private or government-led R&D centers aiming at decarbonization with the South, also using our MTCCs, our maritime centers that were established under one of the EU-funded projects of IMO called GMN. So there are many initiatives ongoing. IMO is also recognizing that we cannot be just the regulatory body. We also need to support, of course, within our own mandate, further discussions with various stakeholders. So we will have another alternative fuel symposium this year. We are also going to have another round of UNEP IMO joint innovation forum, looking at innovation also from a wider perspective. Why IMO is technology neutral, just by the theme, that this year's theme, every year we have one main theme. The ones who follow IMO may know it's called World Maritime Day theme. This year it's new technology for greener shipping. So these are all recognitions from our side that we need to provide even more than just the regulatory framework. We need to engage even more with the stakeholders. We need to support implementation. And we are going all into this direction. Thank you.
Thank you. How to motivate, just picking up on your point there, Georgie, about how to motivate first movers. And one of the issues within the European Union, and coming back to that, is this sense that within the Fit for 55 plan, there isn't really yet a set of targets or incentives for scaling up zero emission fuels or alternative fuels. And I just wanted to come to that question because fuels are, as always, the elephant in the room in this question, and ask you, Michael Parker. I mean, what is the best set of mechanisms to get fuels up and running? One can't necessarily build the ships and the fuels will come, or is it the case that will happen? Because in some ways, some shipping companies are in fact taking that risk at the moment. What do you see as a finance person, the best way to move forward around fuels?
Well, I think, Charles, what we have to remember, and shipping has often sort of been an inward-looking silo, but I think COVID and incessant Zoom meetings globally changed all that. We're a much more open industry now. We have to remember that shipping, whilst it's absolutely key to global trade, is just one industry that has to go through the energy transition. And the energy companies are going to be leading that for the benefit of the global economy as a whole, but shipping has to be part of those discussions. And so the decisions that companies like Ocean Network Express and many of the others like Maersk, which has clearly put its initial bet on methanol, companies are wanting to make investment decisions, and that's sending demand signals to the energy industry around what fuels to create. And so it's an iterative process, I think, that shipping has to be a part of. And part of that's going to be driven by real things. And I'll pick up on Georgie's point about pilots. The most important thing that came out of COP26, as far as shipping is concerned, was the Clydebank Declaration, which the UK government led with 22 other governments at the time, and Singapore, I think, has recently signed up. This is a big pilot. This is the green corridors that come out of the Clydebank Declaration at the same time as the governments announced that. The Getting to Zero Coalition announced its work on green corridors. And that, I think, has a significant signal to the industry, including the energy industry, around real things happening, which will prompt the development of those fuels. So the first route, if you like, that is being talked about is iron ore from Australia to Japan and Korea, and immediately you will get through that governments, as well as the private sector, as well as financial institutions, wanting decisions to be made there about market-based measures that those governments regionally can agree to, regardless of where the IMO or anywhere else has got to, and the cargo owners and the banks and everyone else. So those investment decisions around the fuels and the ships, because the technology is there, the scaling up and the building of the infrastructure, the refueling infrastructure on those routes, that's what will trigger these decisions. But again, as we've said at the beginning of this conversation, as you said in your introduction, there's no one answer to this. So we will see the alternative fuels being developed by the energy sector. And then, of course, there'll be the application to either through retrofitting or through the new technology that the shipbuilders and clearly the engine manufacturers are developing. But it's going to be triggered by real things happening. And I think that goes back to the original point about the risk to the IMO of regulation being too slow. I think that this is where the role of classification societies could be absolutely key, in that if they certify technology that works, the insurance sector, the banking sector, the cargo sector as a whole, I think, will support those investments, and that will, I think, accelerate this process. So I think the alternative fuels, and Jeremy, having made certain decisions as a company recently about what fuels to invest in, I think is an example of there is no single answer to this, and people have different perspectives on timing, and different sectors of shipping will also have different perspectives as to the most suitable fuel they want to use, and a lot of that's going to be to do with the bunkering infrastructure and the ability of fuels to ships to refuel where they need to. It touches again into the length of supply chains in developing states. But I think that it's the demand signals coming from the industry that will prompt the development of those fuels, and that's where we'll start to see real things happening in quite a short time frame. The important thing about the Clydebank Declaration was it put a 5-year time frame on those governments making those plans work. It doesn't mean, of course, that the ships will necessarily be there in 5 years, but putting in place those plans. And as you see more and more announcements, the recent announcement of the corridor between Shanghai and LA, and that's something clearly for the container sector. So I think these are the things that will drive the fuels. I think the IMO will come along and probably regulate after those fuels are already in operation.
So the Clydebank Declaration was, in fact, a declaration that governments made at COP26. How useful is it to have those kinds of targets? And I refer back to the discussion that's going on in the European Union. I'm sorry to bring the European Union up all the time in this, but around scalable zero-emission fuels, and the concern that there isn't a target for 2030, and without the target, the momentum is simply not going to develop to build towards alternative fuels. Jeremy, can I just ask you, do you think these kinds of targets need to be set?
Yeah, I think that the most important target we think is the most important mechanism is to get the market-based measures fixed, Charles, because today, fuel costs, fuel is roughly heading towards $1,000 a ton now. We're talking about the new fuel types being at about probably $2,000 a ton. So if it's $1,000 a ton more expensive and you're burning roughly 4 million tons a year like we are, if you just commit obviously to the new fuels and you have no way of kind of subsidizing that or leveling up with your competitors, you're going to have a $4 billion cost disadvantage. And so no board of directors is going to sign off on a business plan that does that. So we could build 1 or 2 ships. We can look at different pilots and all that kind of stuff, but we're not going to be moving at scale. So we need really to see a concrete proposal come on the table, which allows the first movers to move ahead with significant investment and is a really good green signal to the energy companies. Look, this industry is going to change, it is going to move at scale, and there is going to be demand for these types of fuels to move forward. So in the meantime, we're continuing to invest year by year. Very frankly, we're not going with LNG at the moment because LNG is a carbon fuel. If we could make a major scientific breakthrough, which would get us a very good green LNG type gas, I think the industry would move much, much faster towards LNG with a view that we could move to green LNG. Otherwise, frankly, I think we have to look at green hydrogen and particularly ammonia. And so what we're looking at is building ships now which may work on conventional fuels initially, but are so designed that they can be retroactively fitted to the new fuel types within 3, 4, 5 years after their initial operation. So we think the new fuel types will start coming through, hopefully in 27, 28, 29, so that we can start to retrofit the ships to the new fuels. But we can't commit to switch over to those new fuels with these high cost premiums unless we have some kind of mechanism that comes forward to incentivize and support those first mover advantages. And that's really the crux of the issue.
And clearly there's only so much time that you can continue to run projects and pilots that try to identify what fuels might work and propulsion systems might work best. Leslie, can I come to you? And I mean, we've been having this discussion about about the future, but very much of what needs to happen is, of course, in the present. And that's a lot of what you're focused on. You mentioned that, there are legacy structures that prevent us from decarbonizing the industry, and the digitalization of the industry is hugely important. Could you just lead us through some of the other things that you're doing to do that? Because without this, we are still going to be leaving the industry a long way away from any targets that it might want to meet by 2030.
Yeah, I touched upon that a little bit earlier, but where we really see an opportunity when it comes to decarbonization is around enabling the different industry stakeholders to make better operational decisions. And that comes from two things. That comes first from the ability to predict future outcomes with a high degree of accuracy, and second, around transformation and collaboration. So when you touch upon first that accuracy, high level of accuracy when it comes to predict outcomes, we see all our industry stakeholders having to juggle with predicting ETAs, predicting fuel consumption, understanding the impact on performance of the different fuel types, as we discussed earlier. And this can really only be done through tools that allow them to derive insights from the data that they are gathering. So an example that we have on our end, and results that we are very proud of, is around collaborative voyage optimization. So an example is that is a bulk carrier that is a client of ours that is able to basically remove the equivalent of 1,200 cars a year, because they are able to optimize voyages and reduce consumption. Decarbonization doesn't have to be unsynchronized with profit. In the meantime, through optimization, that same client saved $1 million. So we really believe in the power of optimization that goes hand in hand with maximizing profit. The second aspect that I talked about is around digital transformation. And when we see up to 12% savings coming from voyage optimization, we see 3 times as much opportunity if we had all stakeholders working hand in hand. So we have very strong use cases between ship owners and ship operators that collaborate together around CI grades, around voyage operations, with very, very strong outcomes.
And I think one area we're just about to run into finance now, but I mean, venture-backed startups have played quite an interesting role in helping shipping rethink, in some ways, how to accelerate the decarbonization. Is that right?
Just to give you a bit of backdrop again, when you look at VC investment in supply chain last year, that amount was $11 billion, but only 1.5% of it was directed towards maritime. So a very, very small amount compared to the importance of the shipping supply chain, ocean shipping supply chain. So there is definitely a discrepancy between that VC investment versus the importance of the industry. But we've seen that being reversed with more and more influx of capital coming from stakeholders that have traditionally not invested in maritime, have been focused on climate innovation, but not on maritime. And so last year, as an example, but a strong one, we had discussions with Microsoft and closed this year our Series B with Microsoft Climate Innovation Fund as our lead investor. This is the first time that Climate Innovation Fund invested in a maritime focused company. And so that basically says a lot when it comes to the importance or the renewal of the importance of ocean shipping in the eye of investors that have traditionally not been focused on this industry.
I want to come finally, if I can, to this question of the role of finance. And of course, we saw at COP26 a big move towards drawing finance in a large-scale way towards decarbonization. But Michael, I just want to ask you, if I can, to start this discussion off. How do you see finance really being an enabler of an accelerated progress in decarbonization of shipping, and what exactly is happening in that area at this point?
Thank you, Charles. Yes, I mean, look, I think finance drives this, and we've talked about the role of regulators and governments, and I think what governments know is that without the private sector leading this, nothing will really happen. Well, if we wait for governments or if we wait for the IMO's decision-making timetables, it'll be much slower. So finance wants to decarbonize the global economy. Society wants us to meet the ambition of the Paris Agreement. And I think one of the two things I would say about this, which are sort of relevant, and then I'll come back and give you a very quick answer. The first one is digitalization is now making the consumer drive this. The consumer is now able to make decisions that they weren't able to make before because they have the data. The second point is people now realize that the shipping industry is the most important industry to decarbonize the global economy. If we don't get shipping done, we won't meet the Paris Agreement. Every other industry's Scope 3 emissions are in their supply chains, hence the importance of this industry, and hence the recognition by people like Jeremy and others in other sectors in shipping that we need to get on and do this, and we need government to support it. The money is going to go to those investments that people can illustrate will make a difference. And I think the great advantage, and again, this is to the credit of the IMO through the DCS regulation they brought in 18 that applied from 19, is that we can measure emissions in the shipping industry. So in finance, we were the Poseidon Principles were the first framework of any industry that the banking sector, if you like, came up with to measure alignment with the IMO's current ambition. And then the Sea Cargo Charter, the big commodity companies. Sea Cargo Charter's membership represents over 3/4 of all bulk commodities moved in the world. And then we had the announcement just before COP of the COSERV Alliance, which is around consumers. So you can see that what's happening here is that those institutions, financial institutions in the private sector, we have shareholders, we have regulators, want to drive this process. And that's why investors and capital markets and everyone else really wants to direct this investment as quickly as possible. But what we need is, on the financial side, is we need common definitions. We need investors want to see an end to greenwashing. The sustainable bond market is probably going to be over $3 trillion outstanding by the end of this year. The money is there, but it wants clarity, it wants definitions to be understood, and it needs these market-based measures are a way of getting the money from one place to the other, but the private sector's money is there and waiting. And I think that's what we're going to see an acceleration of, because without the private sector investing in this, it isn't going to happen. Governments are not going to make this happen. And I think the great thing is shipping has a huge advantage in getting this done quickly, because as I said, without the shipping industry decarbonizing, no industry will meet its commitments to Paris. Banks are important because we are regulated institutions by the same governments that sit in the IMO and other bodies, and they are holding bank managements to account on the commitments we and other banks have made to net zero by 2050. So we are going to have to make lending and investing decisions that means our portfolios will be net zero by 2050. And the great thing, as I said, about shipping is we can measure emissions through the IMO regulation to help the shipping industry do that. And it's been a very collaborative affair between those of us in banking and insurance and on the chartering side to actually make this happen. So finance will be and is the big driver, and I think will be the driver of the pace of this, and that's why I'm very optimistic about it.
Jeremy, is finance driving you to think about how quickly you decarbonize and how you do it?
Well, I think, Charles, as Michael says, it's a very key point. Finance is very, very important, but probably the two key things are, as we say, the availability of green fuel, particularly green hydrogen, and as Michael says, if we can decarbonize shipping, we can decarbonize the world, and there's a real danger that green hydrogen will be scooped up and used for land-based industries, which do have other options, where we desperately need it for the deep sea fleets. And secondly, of course, the shipyard capacity. At the end of the day, we probably only have enough shipyard capacity globally to retonnage about 3% of the global fleet each year. So I think we also have to be realistic. This is not going to happen overnight. Each year, potentially 3% of new ships could be built with the new technology and the new fuels. But we need to get that financing in place, particularly these market-based measures, so that we can start to make those big key investments, and that the fuel companies, energy companies, are really serious that we're going to do it, and they're going to be investing in producing this green hydrogen. And at the same time, the shipyards are also giving, the designs and the priority to build those new types of ships, so that every year as we move forward, another 3% of green assets come in and another 3% are sunsetted of the old technology. So incrementally we move forward. So it is finance, it is shipyards, it is fuel, but we need these market-based measures to really drive it all.
Georgie, can I just pick up on a point that you had earlier and just sort of reflecting this discussion we're having on finance, and that is that there isn't really finance available, is there? Not a great deal of finance for some of the developing countries you've been concerned about in the IMO, and that financing is a risky proposition from a private sector point of view, and often needs states and multilateral development banks to step in as guarantors. What do you see as the financing challenge that developing countries face in respect to their own decarbonization of shipping?
Thank you, Charles, for this question. This is actually the angle I was missing from the discussion, so thanks for bringing it up. Indeed, when we were running our FinSmart roundtable with the World Bank and EBRD, one of the key outcomes or key recommendation was that the MDBs, so the development banks, and ODA investment in developing countries in maritime decarbonization needs to be done now, or it would have needed to be done yesterday. It is clear that for the private investment, it's too risky to invest many times in developing countries, especially in these developed countries and small island developing states. At the same time, they are an important piece of the puzzle that we don't leave anyone behind. And one key challenge that we have seen, just to add to the different pieces of the puzzle or things of miscommunication or no communication, is ODA. So development aid assistance to countries. Maritime is not really part of it. Why is this? Probably because ODA is usually in the developed country world is sitting by the foreign ministries or a special development aid ministry or government body, while in the developing countries, the ones that are applying for ODA, they are not the maritime people either. So there is a disconnect really, and there's no recognition of the importance of maritime for development, even though maritime is key for many of the developing countries' LDCs and seeds. And as we know, climate change is an important priority to invest for many of the donors, including the EU. But this connection to be made, that we need to invest in maritime decarbonization projects, is just simply not there, unfortunately. Just to give you an example, one of the biggest environment funds in the world is JEF. There's 0.2% jet financing going to maritime environmental issues. So I think that this is something on which we can and we should work together. It's a common objective, I believe, for all the stakeholders. Of course, there's overall a bigger, we call it sometimes blue blindness or maritime blindness. Many of the consumers are not aware either that the products that are receiving most of the time, starting from a banana to an iPhone, are coming on ships. And this is as much true for the consumer as much for the person sitting in a ministry dealing with ODA. And I think that it's changing slightly. It's changing slightly also because we have big companies that made big commitments to decarbonize their whole life cycle, decarbonize their supply chain. So this also means, of course, shipping. So it will be more and more clear that these companies can also undertake these commitments if they also invest in shipping decarbonization. But this also has the side of investing in ports, investing in developing country ports, investing in LDCs and seeds. And I really hope that slowly, but all the pieces of the Rubik Cube puzzle will go to its pieces. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. And I like that term maritime blindness in relation to developing countries particularly. I think we've heard through this discussion just how much is actually happening, but also just how much there is in fact to do and how important the next 6 months to a year will be in the decarbonization of shipping. We will be taking up this issue, no doubt, at our World Ocean Summits. We have our World Ocean Summit Insights Hours. We have one on World Ocean Day, New Frontiers in Ocean Innovation. We have the second World Ocean Summit in Asia Pacific in Singapore, finally a live event and a physical event that's happening on November the 29th and the 30th. And then, of course, we have our 10th annual World Ocean Summit happening in Lisbon in Portugal on February the 28th to March the 2nd, 2023. I just want to thank all of our speakers, Jeremy Nixon, Chief Executive of Ocean Network Express, Georgie Govan, who's head of the project's implementation side at the IMO, Michael Parker, who's Chairman of Global Shipping and Logistics and Offshore at Citi, and Leslie Dang, Managing Director at Singapore for Nautilus Labs. Thank you all for your time and your excellent comments, and I hope that's been a good stock take of where we are on the shipping decarbonization issue, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Insight Hour. Thank you.